I want to invite Lidia for the first talk. Please join me welcoming her.
Many thanks for everything, for inviting me to this amazing conference. And I've just explained that yesterday's reception, this was something out of this world for me. So thank you, Sue, and the whole team for organizing this. So this is the title of my talk. I had a little bit a different idea of this talk, but then Sue said that this was going to be the title of my presentation. And I said, well, if so, this would be just one slide. That's what I emailed Sue, but Sue ignored this. So I thought I have to think about this. And then I thought, well, we can learn lessons from everything, even if you think that there are no lessons, and these are lessons from in Australia. So I'll be talking about management of indoor air quality in Australia before and during the pandemic, with a specific focus on schools. It's impossible to talk about all types of buildings. Schools are a very good example of the problems. Building design and engineering controls and the future. Now, but when I talk about building design and engineering controls, particularly building designs, just remember that I'm a simple physicist, scientist. I'm not a designer. So I wanted to make this statement. I'm talking about Australia, but every Australian state is different. Different climate, different environment, different governments. We, of course, won't be talking about, or I won't be talking about all of this, the crocodiles and the penguins, different part of Australia, nor the climate or the environment, but the governance. And this is really the key and the difference it makes. So if we were to summarize the management of indoor air quality, what's happening in Australia and in other countries, well, there's one statement. There's no indoor air quality standard. When I mention this to people from outside this area, they are surprised, very surprised. How come? There are outdoor air quality standards and forms, but no indoor air quality standards. I coined this some time ago. Indoor air quality is a regulatory no man's land. We summarized with a colleague from China, what's happening in the countries about indoor air quality in this publication. So what are the factors contributing to progress in managing indoor air quality? Globally, very complex political, social and legislative situation regarding indoor air quality, lack of open, systematic, harmonized approach. And we could stop here, but there is a more detailed list of this. And well, in Australia, like in other countries, it really applies to all the countries. No single national government authority responsible for indoor air quality. They're no man's land. Environmental legislation and health legislation are the discretion of individual states in Australia, not the federal government. In other countries, it's provinces, dependently what's the division. Now, extremely important, there are no performance standards for the indoor environment, only design and operational standards. Occupational and environments are treated differently than residential, and information is usually confidential. Where did I take this list from? Now, this is, if you can see at the bottom, this is proceedings from the conference, indoor healthy building conference in Finland in 2000. Nothing has changed since then. These are exactly the points I had and exactly the slide I had then. So it's not that the pandemic changed something. The pandemic just highlighted these problems. And well, finally, we get some traction of people listening. So let's move to schools and the kind of snippets of the problems to make this big picture clearer. One of the issues is that pollution sources are inside and outside schools, not only schools, but in schools this is even more obvious. One of the first experience for me was with schools, was a project which we had for reasons that there was a road built around the schools and potential impact on the air quality indoors. And we started the measurements, and on the first day of the measurements, we realized this extremely high concentration of ultrafine particles, particle number concentration, an order of magnitude higher than anywhere else outside. What was the reason? The Department of Education asked me whether the school should be closed. I didn't have a clue what the reason was. Later study, a few months later, revealed that it was what we already started suspecting, that this was secondary particles forming in the classrooms from the precursors, from all this chemistry brought into classrooms by the paints, glues, and all the art supplies. So these are the sources, indoor sources, and many different types of sources. But still that link between indoor and outdoor air. Here we did some kind of meta-analysis of the studies focusing on particle matter, PM2.5 and PM10, mass concentration of particles, and particle number concentration, which is basically ultrafine particles. Now, what we found was very interesting, comparing different types of buildings or facilities, home, school, and office. We found out that the sources were different. So for homes, particle number concentration, of which sources are mainly combustion, but also secondary particles, come mainly from the sources inside, while larger particles, particle mass, come mainly from outside. But for schools, it is completely the other way around. These larger particles are from indoor sources. Part of this is mainly dust brought by the kids inside, but particle number, ultrafine particles, come from outside, and this is usually the traffic or vehicles around the schools. In offices, usually everything comes from outside. So you can see that dependently on the type of the buildings and the sources, the situation is very different. Now, then came bushfires. I must say that until the time of bushfires at the end of 2019, beginning 2020, air pollution in Australia was a topic, well, somewhere there, it's not in Australia. But this brought home the issue of air pollution. And here the problems, among many other problems, parents worried that schools aren't equipped for air quality. And one last aspect of this schools, and here we are talking about exposure, or what comes from exposure is dose. It's this. So if we look at the top diagram, it is inhaled surface area dose. So it doesn't matter dose of what was inhaled in terms of particle number. For different types of environments, the kids were wearing monitors for 24 hours. So what we can see that inhaled surface dose is the highest at home sleeping, the lowest at commuting. Why? Because the commuting time is the shortest. And if we look, however, at the intensity of the exposure or dose, it is the other way around. Commuting is the highest intensity, home sleeping is the lowest. But the point here is that if we look at what's happening at school, both the dose and the intensity are the highest. So we can talk about the school environment for quite a long time, but I hope that I highlighted the issues there. So let's talk about ventilation in schools. In Australia, basically all the schools, very small fraction, are ventilated in a different way than natural. Schools are ventilated naturally and not by systems like Roger were explaining. It is just open the window. And a recent study conducted in Victoria showed that ventilation rates range from 1.6 liters per second per person. That's basically nothing. And 7 out of 10 schools had ventilation rates well below recommended minimum. Now, here is the natural ventilation understood in that very I don't know, it's a good way, primitive way, open the window. So in homes, schools, restaurants, shops, when it is not too cold, not too hot, not too noisy, the window is open. But the reality, as we are experiencing in Australia all the time, in most of the climates across Australia, there's a problem. Too cold, too hot, too noisy, too polluted, sometimes too unsafe. Windows are closed, there's no ventilation. So in this understanding of ventilation, by opening the window, basically natural ventilation is no ventilation. The worrying thing is that when the WHO recommends ventilation, it is that concept, open the window, without understanding that there's much more to this. If I say that there's no ventilation, disclaimer, of course, there's always some air coming in. Now, but with this, there's also that other problem. All right, we open the window, even if we can, but what if the source is outside? This was the problem during the bushfires. Concentrations inside were extremely high because of the bushfires. But then there's the issue, for example, in the tropics. This is a statement from the Northern Territory government. Mold in the tropics is very significant, and then that opening the window is not necessarily sufficient. I'll come back to this and a continuation of this slide. But let's now talk about what was happening, or what has happening during the pandemic in Australia. It will be a quick run during across the different actions by different states. So we'll start with New South Wales. In October last year, so about last year, there was the Department of Education, we are talking about schools, conducted statewide review using a model, and they proudly announced how many interiors, spaces, schools were modeled, and the conclusion was that everything is basically fine. Well, this was challenged. Professor Greg Hanmer, in his analysis, he showed that the model was flawed, and without measurements of ventilation, we don't know much. For example, if in the model is the window which opens like this, and most of the windows are like this, well, the situation is very different. Or if the window is bolted and it cannot open. The Department of Education actually discouraged parents to measure CO2. Why to do it? But something even more amazing was when I talked to Jeff recently, was the statement by the New South Wales Premier during that was some kind of an event when he was saying what was done, and basically the statement was instill confidence. So whether it works or whether it doesn't work, but as long as it appears that you are doing something in charge, it's fine, with or without the backing of science. To me, this was mind-boggling, really. Now, Victoria is the most progressive state in Australia in terms of doing something. Last year in September, this number, over 50,000 air purifiers was purchased, and this is just one of the actions. I'm not talking about everything, which was done. And then a little bit later, announcement that all the schools and the areas which needed air purification were equipped with the purifier. But there was that media interview, radio interview, I was interviewed by the journalist, and there were some parents or community allowed their voice as well. So that was the statement from one of them, that in my child's primary school, the equipment is never turned on. Well, I then had personal communication from somebody else, and we're talking about Victoria. It's always on. So this device really very much depends whether the person in charge of this teacher or whoever turns it on or not, and when. Well, the situation in Queensland is particularly interesting. there was absolutely no action whatsoever about ventilation until the end of last year. During the school break, summer holiday, December, January, 5 out of over 1,200 schools were audited for ventilation. Actually, in some interviews, I was saying that the Queensland government, and I'm not talking about the Department of Education, but in general, government doesn't know how to spell the word ventilation. So there's a different now perspective of the community. This is from an email which I received from a teacher. I'm reaching out to you as the teacher who has been investigating ventilation in my school. So first of all, the Department of Education failed to procure any CO2 monitors for schools and filters and so on. Nothing is happening. But this teacher, did his own investigations showing that concentrations of CO2 are very, very high in many schools. Now, this was published again in a media interview. So I started with citing scientific papers. Now it is from the media. That's the only source of information. And the same teacher, very active, was extremely frustrated why there is no centrally dictated COVID management across the state. And we're talking about ventilation. If left to principals, health measures are more easily ignored and the risk with other risk outbreaks. Well, there are other ways of doing this. A group of dads in one of the schools got together, discussed this with the school principal, who was very supportive of the action. The dads were quite educated in building engineering, luckily. So they used a smoke machine, studied airflow patterns in the schools, then they bought CO2 meters and identified dead spots, then they purchased air purifiers. And as a result of this action, the school stayed free of COVID during the Omicron wave in Queensland. That was when this was published. And this was the highest wave so far in Queensland, in Australia in general. Now, open the window. Here is what our Minister for Education claims. Our excellent Queensland weather means that ventilation of learning spaces can often occur naturally by opening windows. Interestingly, this was published at the time when we had the coldest winter so far. And the buildings are such that in my home, which is very tight, temperature in the morning was about 14 degrees. I think we are outside the range when we can easily adopt. So winter temperature in some places are down to 0. Summer quite often about 40 degrees in places, bushfire, smoke, traffic. All right. Again, a parent stated that my son's school classroom had a couple of COVID outbreaks, so they are not allowing to open the window in his classrooms, so use air purifiers. And the same parent stating, okay, I'm purchasing an air purifier for his classroom. What's the best place to locate it? This way or this way? So he asked me for advice. No guidance provided whatsoever. But at least that parent was able to buy it. But another parent in another school, this is independent school, was trying to convince the school to buy and install air purifier and paying herself for that air purifier. So again, ask for some advice on this. But unfortunately, a little bit later, she said, I just wanted to let you know I was unsuccessful in convincing the school to install air purifiers. No reasons given. Well, just a note about air purifier. If we have just air purifier and we have no ventilation, no air movement, so we know very well what's the impact of increased concentration of CO2 of cognition and on the impact of many other gaseous pollutants which are emitted or formed indoors, like those particles which I showed at the beginning. So just air purifier without ventilation is not a satisfactory solution for indoor air quality in general. So the last point on this review of what's been happening, all right, turn on air conditioner. So this is, again, a statement from the minister. Every single classroom, library, and so on in Queensland schools has now air conditioner. And further on, the use of air ventilation and air conditioning system, so that the system that introduces fresh air from outside. Now, this is the fresh air from outside by the air conditioner. Probably the minister doesn't realize that these split air conditioner systems, which are the main ones used in Queensland, in Australia in general, do not bring in air from outside. So the windows are closed, everything's closed, just air conditioned, turning air around. And I've measured extremely high concentration of CO2 in situations like this. Well, I guess you have an overview of what's been happening. So let's come back to the topic of building design and engineering controls. Now, I started with this natural ventilation in this kind of oversimplistic way of meaning this, airing, opening windows to let air in and out, and we've discussed this, we saw during the CLIMA conference. So I'm just clarifying what I mean here. So if this is just airing, so all the problems which I've just explained, and in addition, it may not provide, even if all the windows are open and can be opened, it may not provide sufficient ventilation, but it's also that issue of energy invested in heating and cooling. So really, when we are talking about natural ventilation, this should be like what Roger explained, coming back to the past, building which relies on its design and interaction with the local environment to provide ventilation. So this is kind of rediscovering the America, but in Australia, this kind of natural ventilation operates not this. And if we have this system, provision of sufficient ventilation and also energy preserved by heat energy methods. But such systems are very, very rare. Now, the role between natural and mechanical ventilation in schools, this is a study which is still on the prep read but under review right now, ventilation and COVID in schools in Marseille region. So what we have here is incident cases in the whole region. So this is this curve, and this was done between September last year and January this year. And this is the incidence case, and as you can see, this logarithmic scale. So this is the in the state, and then there were, well, most of the schools in that region in Italy are also naturally ventilated, but for the purpose, during the pandemic, the government equipped this 316 classroom with mechanical ventilation systems. So this is the incidence case in the classrooms without mechanical ventilation, and this is with mechanical ventilation. But it cannot be compared because the numbers are much smaller. So really the comparison is this, the boxes. And this is incidence proportion per 1,000 students. So not going into any more details, but if you look at this, for the schools equipped with mechanical ventilation system, the rate was significantly higher, significantly because this is logarithmic scale. Now, there are, however, limits to that ventilation, however we look at this natural or mechanical ventilation. To investigate these limits, we've done comparative analysis of, I think this was about 10 different pathogens, bacteria and viruses. And for this 4, including SARS-CoV-2, but this was the first, the wild variant, Delta and Omicron over past measles, we found out that for the cases we've studied, even high ventilation rate of 14 liters per second, which is much more than WHO currently recommends, or RIVA of 10 liters per second, it will not be possible to maintain the event reproduction number below 1 in a fully susceptible population. So we cannot keep going with the ventilation and keep increasing ventilation if we are faced with this kind of extremely infectious pathogens. And this is not a discovery. Nothing here is a discovery. We knew this. This is a study by Ed Nardell and colleagues published in 1991. You probably considers it as theoretical limits of protection of ventilation. So, yes, there are limits. And what do we do? What do we do to control the risk of infections by such pathogens? Disinfect the air, but in a way that generates no additional pollution indoors. And what is the system which would achieve this? Germicidal UV air disinfection, lower energy requirements, does not generate new pollutants, robust, silent, low cost. And if we move to extension of this technology, I'm very careful not to use new technology, it's just different wavelengths. It is safe with very low penetration into human tissue, which means it could be doing to the air the same what we are doing already to the water. Every drop of water we drink is disinfected. And again, as revolutionary as it may sound, we know that it's not. If we look at its first applications in 1930s, 1940s in the United States in schools to protect kids against measles and successful applications, we have had these technologies and they are being used in some parts, like, for example, in South Africa, where tuberculosis is a big problem. But we thought that we have vaccines against measles, other respiratory infections transmitted through the air. Who cares about this? So we went away from this. So the future. What lessons have we learned about schools? Well, first of all, we've learned during the pandemic that there are big problems with indoor air quality and ventilation in schools, and that bringing air from outside is not a solution for healthy indoor air if the source is outside, and if outside thermal conditions are not favorable. Not just comfort, but physiological impact. And I'm talking about extremes here, so it's not about whether it's 25 or 27, whether it's above 40. So there's no simple solution to how to control all indoor air risks at the school, none with the current natural ventilation systems. So this was the issue of the kids' dehydration, which was reported in these extreme temperatures in Western Australia. So this is one part of the story for which we would, and we have solutions. But even bigger problem is the management and policies. So lack of health and science-based recommendations, misguidance, creation of confusion and mistrust. So it's a very, very different issue. How to control indoor airborne infection transmission in Australia? This was my advice to the then Minister for Health in May last year, and well, he rang me after our science paper was published. And that's what I suggested, 4 points. Facilitate the establishment of a consistent national regulatory infrastructure for clean indoor air for Australians. This applies to Australia, this applies to any other country. The key elements: explicit inclusion of protections against indoor air hazards, including airborne infection control. Establish an interdisciplinary panel of experts. This will not be resolved by just one type of expertise or the other. We need scientists, engineers, even so as engineers at the beginning of the pandemic when we were trying to convince the WHO, we were saying that they are just engineers. I'm a scientist, but they're just engineers. They don't know what they're talking about. Architects, public health professionals. So we all the expertise areas need to be included. And, well, establish a national fund enabling the rollout of indoor environment modernization measures, well, addressing both immediate emergencies, but we need to look at the long-term transmission process. This was later published, slightly more condensed form in the conversation. Has anything happened about this? I know you have an answer. Nothing so far. So, if we were to summarize this, what needs to be done, indoor air quality regulation in Australia, national health-based performance standards are needed for sufficient number of parameters. We won't be able to measure everything, that are feasible to measure and are legislated to be enforced in every environment. This conversation hasn't started yet. Building must be designed to meet the standards. The design will be in accordance with the local climatic and environmental conditions. This conversation hasn't started yet. Now, I've listed these different temporary measures during the pandemic. Of course, they are very important, but often or mostly not implemented, often not feasible, at the discretion of individuals, like this school teachers turn on and off. So the worry is that any temporary measure will, once the pandemic is eventually over, will be abandoned. We need permanent measures. Is this just an Australian issue? 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got this request from Emeritus Professor Olli Sapanen, past president of ISIAC, and Riva, who was trying to get me to help him to convince a group of Nordic countries to do something. And that's how he summarized. The problem is how to convince authorities to believe, but I added to want to listen, that something can be done and then there is enough knowledge and experience to do something. So the issue is global. Now, when I was saying that nothing has changed, and yesterday during conversation, during the reception, and this is the benefit of being together, when we talk together, ideas came up. I realized something has really fundamentally changed in Australia, despite of all of what I said. This was a statement of a reviewer for our application for Australian Research Council, ARC grant application, when we wanted to take further what we generated by then in terms of understanding of particle characteristics from human respiratory activities into the building and into how to implement this infection transmission in buildings. Well, if airborne transmission is not possible, so grant was, of course, not successful. No grants were successful. We basically abandoned trying this. But 3 weeks ago, this application, which I led, Advanced Building Systems, also ARC, Advanced Building System Against Airborne Infection Transmission, was funded. And just last Monday, my laureate fellowship, ARC laureate fellowship, my air, my space, my health, the science of building that helped us thrive, was funded. Between these two projects is over $10 million. So things have changed. At least we start talking about this. But for me, working with the large teams from around the world, the key question now is, or two key questions. What we know but don't do because of political drivers, cost perceived, etc. We don't want to rediscover the America. We know things. And what are the key big scientific questions in your area? So when I'm directing this to everybody, of expertise that the center and this research should resolve. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention on this extremely complex topic where science, technology, awareness, and politics are mixed together.
Thank you very much. Thank you.